topic because I presented this in 2010 up in Juneau, Alaska, when we had transplanted black rockfish to Lighthouse Park in West Vancouver. So it's probably the best accomplishment I've ever achieved with rockfish conservation. So just to give you the story, these were a 1995 birth out in Ucluelet. They were captured as yearlings. About 250 of them were taken to the aquarium and from the west coast, Vancouver Island, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife coded wire tagged all of them that fall, and then over the fall of 97, spring of 98, as young adults, they were getting big. We put about 200 of them at Point Atkinson, and we observed them growing up for a period of a couple of years, and then it happened that the remainder were in our big Pacific Canada tank, and the curators said, it's too much biomass, we're going to have to start euthanizing these fish. Killing rockfish? And so Peter Welch, who was running the Pacific Ocean Shelf Tracking Program with acoustic tags for salmon, said, no, you got to tag them and release them. So we took sexually mature adults, same cohort, they're all from Ucluelet, and we transplanted them in 2004, 2005. And then since then, it seems like a numerical bias, but we've had 2004, 2006, 2008, and 2010 year classes that have had survival there, which is pretty good, and nothing since then. So this is well, you can't see that it's out of focus. It's through a curved helicopter window. So that's Lighthouse Park, that's Point Atkinson, and the yellow dot is where we got a little research closure for the one reef. It's a good rocky reef at that site. And you can see from the rocks offshore, it's probably one of the best places there is for offshore casting. And so it's a famous place for fishing up to that point. And we got the fishing closure signs up, and we still had the poachers there. And to make a long story short, we wound up putting Chinese, Vietnamese signs with the phone number and pinned them to the walls right on the ledges where the poachers were fishing. And that effectively displaced them. It didn't stop them from poaching, but it moved them from this reef, and that worked fairly well. You can't see this shot at all. These are black rockfish in a tank, and the red spaghetti tag means it's a sham. It hasn't been operated on. The yellow spaghetti tags are just individuals that had had a surgical implantation of the big acoustic tag. And then they were put in a cage, and the cage on the bottom to give them time to acclimate, and then that was unzipped by divers. And so that was all done in 2004, 2005. And of course, we had done the transplant of babies, of yearlings at Point Atkinson. And during this period, the orange is the rockfish conservation areas in Howe Sound. And the blue bars are just the number of rockfish per dive at all the little white dots through Howe Sound, where we were looking inside and outside of rockfish conservation areas. And the only place where we were seeing black rockfish was at the transplant site, at a time when they were probably all sexually immature. And this is a map of White Cliff Park is here. Bird Islets is the sort of the nearest rocky reef in this direction from Point Atkinson. We put an acoustic receiver there. We put acoustic receivers on both sides of this complicated reef where we were releasing the black rockfish, and we put one very nearby at Caulfield Cove on a big rocky reef. And we never ever got a single black rockfish bleed at either of those outlier places. They were always going back and forth on the reef.
You do now?
Yeah, we do now. Yeah. But I'm not going to show you the sort of data I was showing up in Juneau, Alaska. This is like one individual tag during July of 2005, and the red is the number of detections at one of the receivers, and the black is at another receiver. And so most of the time, the rockfish is out in front where both receivers are getting them, but there were periods of time when it would go around a corner where the red receiver wasn't picking them up, and the opposite was also true, where they'd go around to the other side of the reef and only be picked up on the other side. And if anyone's interested, it's all been published, and we can give you that. But oh wow, we got a rough time. Can anybody see it? That's a black rockfish.
Yeah, we can see.
There's a conspicuous black spot at the posterior end of the first dorsal fin when they're juveniles. So that's in 2009. That's one of the 2008 black rockfish. And so in 2009, you remember that at various dive sites up to 2005 or 6, we were only seeing them at Point Atkinson. In 2009, we were getting a good number of black rockfish per hour diving at Point Atkinson, but we were getting just about as many around the corner at the Bird Islets, which is right here. And Larsen Bay is just inshore from the Bird Islets, but there are other sites outlying, and then since then there's been a black rockfish seen on the north shore of Bowen Island and such. So individuals got a little bit further, and this is just where we put our receivers. It's the depth range, and it's the two sides of this reef. That doesn't really tell you much. And that's just depth soundings where we were doing 3D mapping of the seabed, and frankly that doesn't tell you much. This won't tell you much, but this is side scan sonar put together, Photoshop, so this all sort of looks like nonsense because we're cutting different pieces, but to the inshore, it gets too shallow and you don't pick anything up, and the black that's below the boat is because it's side scan. These are depths probably greater than 100 feet, so really it's only picking up, say, 60 to 30 feet depth, and all it shows you is that it's this complicated site, and boulder piles were right in here. There's some piled boulders here, and we had a receiver here, we had a receiver here, and the rockfish, really, this is their home. And like Roy says, the sport salmon trolling, the professional guides, get black rockfish well off Point Atkinson. They say they're spanking, healthy-looking things, and they release them, and they're fine. Black rockfish are easy to release because they can get gas out of their swim bladders, so they don't have a problem when they're caught. But they are grounded here, and we've always known that they're below diving depths. 160, 170 feet, there's a boulder pile there, and last year I put down a drop cam and we got the black rockfish there. But I keep waiting for fish that are now sexually mature at the Bird Islets to reproduce. And so this is one of the things I want to talk about today, spend a little time, because we have been through climate regime shifts and such, and I haven't seen any rockfish year classes to write home about in the last half decade. And so that's what we're really waiting for. And I don't know if you can see it, but I just got concentric red circles going from Point Atkinson. Lots of dispersal this far, and a fair amount of dispersal this far, and the comfort feeling for rockfish conservation area enthusiasts is that the distance of dispersal of larvae is such that the distance between rockfish conservation areas on average is about right for the distance they can go. Now, the shocker is that black rockfish off coastal Oregon drift 100 kilometers. That's the open ocean where the current is continuously net transport in one direction. English Bay is one big retention gyre. The reef we released them at is on the edge of Starboat Cove, which has a very strong retention gyre. And we've even, with the tagging, there would be salmon that would go into Starboat Cove and stay there for a while. So it's a very complicated oceanography on our coastal fjords, and we can't expect to take a literature for dispersal of rockfish out in the open ocean and have them follow our rule book, as it were. So this is remarkably small dispersal. And actually, just off the top of my head, we see quillback year classes like Mignon and Apinos. We've had some really strong quillback year classes in this part of Howe Sound. Don't see them at all over here. So the two sides of Howe Sound, whether you're talking spot prawns or quillback rockfish, it's a complicated area, and animals don't necessarily move the way we would out in the open ocean. And so the big transplant is where that yellow arrow is there at Point Atkinson. This is the Bird Islets right here. So this is White Cliff Park. Now, we've got a legacy in the room. Andy, where are you? I can't see you. Yeah. Andy Lamb has records. He has bona fide records of big numbers. He and Neil McDaniel saw big numbers of black rockfish before they were fished out at the end of the 60s at Point Atkinson. But there were just as many black rockfish at White Cliff. White Cliff Park's a very famous place, and there were big schools of black rockfish. Black rockfish, in fact, were sort of filthy throughout the whole Sound area, but in the days of the Sun Salmon Derby, they were a bycatch discard, considered trash. So we have to get over that. So I'm waiting to see them come back to Whitecliff. There's no reason on earth they shouldn't. And as soon as we have some successful year classes from these big, beautiful blacks that are right there at the bird islets, you can see from the bird islets to Whitecliff. It's right there. So that's the end of this slideshow, and I don't think it took any 15 minutes. So are there questions about this particular subject? Yes?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could clarify a bit. When you put the first juvenile transplants down, did you see those proliferate? Or
We saw them grow up.
Okay.
Right at the time of the transplant, there were, in fact, reef surveys at Whitecliff showed that there were at least a few of them that went as far as Whitecliff, and so the little blacks, but they never were seen to persist there because, we put a couple hundred at Point Atkinson, and we watched them grow up.
So then was it the adults that you later released that are the ones that are most successful?
The ones that we released as young have had successful offspring before we released the tag sexually mature adults. But the sexually mature adults that we released was the 2006 year class, which was the biggest, but I got to step back. My friends in Washington State said, blow it off, Marliave. Those all came from the Strait of Juan de Fuca because we had blacks, the 2006 year class, flooded into Puget Sound. It was a big year class, but they didn't have a 2004 year class coming into Puget Sound. They didn't have a 2006 year class. A 2008 year class or 2010 year class. The 2006 is the only year class that was strong in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And in fact, getting to English Bay from Strait of Juan de Fuca, you've got the Fraser River, Plume, Arrow Strait. They're all kind, and you've got all the San Juan Islands and the South Gulf Islands. There's lots of lovely places to stop on the way. So, the groundfish conference, the guys up there are willing to buy it. Yeah, they're probably your fish, but I'm never going to prove it. I'm not trying to do DNA. Any other questions?
I was just wondering.
This talk, in fact, is a little bit more generalized, but I'm not necessarily going to answer your question specifically because go on and on about. But you all, I hope, know that rockfish give live birth. Their larvae are fully formed. They're ready to feed the day they come out. And I actually have the reason I had to change this talk was that the new version that's here has a larval rockfish. I am an ichthyoplankton freak, okay? I like larvae. And this talk has a whole bunch of slides removed because when it comes to citizen science, man, I can't see a thing except a reflection of the sun. Can people see a lingcod in this picture?
Yeah, down
Little lingcod. He's guarding his very obvious egg mass. And so in terms of citizen science for the Vancouver Aquarium, there's never really been any problem having a public lingcod egg mass survey. There could be big problems trying to make sense of the kinds of results we can get, but we ask for what is reasonable for people to do. And I'll say right now that for an entire decade, we were a complete squat zero failure trying to do a rockfish abundance survey, and had sort of, Gestalt encounters with grad students at UBC who would try it. And basically the story I got was that people felt intimidated about actually naming the species, right? And so people who teach reef courses and such have been a big help. And this is actually incorrect. Surveys can be conducted any time of the year. We don't say that anymore. We're asking people to please do it from August through October because I'm going to be talking about rockfish winter hiding and because spring plankton bloom. There are times of year when it's rough to see rockfish relative to other times. The pictures here to show big fat female yellow eye, the young adult, and a baby. And newly settled baby yellow eyes are black with white outlines. The red shows up a little bit later. So it's really tricky identifying rockfish at different life stages and such. And so I'm pleased, and I can't take any credit for it, but my staff have done a really great job of having courses and offering to help. And probably the biggest thing that brought us into success the last few years, and I've mentioned this to Jenna, for people who might be doing surveys here, or some of these people from UVic, Donna Gibbs, who's an affiliate of Andy's, will take videos if you put it in Dropbox or something, and she'll go through it and she'll tell you exactly which rockfish you had. And of course she'll keep data herself, but it works nicely and a lot of people like doing that. So we've got certain individuals who send us videos all the time, and it's a great interaction. Now, I wish you could see these better, but the rockfish conservation areas came about from discussions where, with the live fishery for the Asian market, there was a realization in the 1980s that this really was not going to wind up being sustainable, and all the fishery biologists felt that, yeah, you know, if only we could be more precautionary, we would try and rein this thing in. And there are really 6 species of inshore rockfish, but the ones I've been talking about, black rockfish, are not highlighted on the map booklet because on the outer coast there's very, very abundant. It's in the inside waters here in the Strait of Georgia that you could have concern for them. And there's an outer coast species, the China rockfish, which, and I don't know if you can see it, it's dark blue with bright yellow dots and yellow markings. And of course the tiger rockfish, which is unmistakable. I've seen as many as 11 on a dive, but they're never really associating with each other unless to try and beat each other off. Probably the most abundant in the Strait of Georgia is the quillback, but it occurs at all depths. And then the copper rockfish, if you're diving in shallow water or you're jigging right next to the shoreline, is probably the most common species run across. And then historically, the yellow-eye, which was commonly called the red snapper, is a very interesting species. It's attractive in fish markets and such. It's a big species. And it's important to us in the Strait of Georgia because this is the species that was fished down to low abundance as a bycatch discard back before World War II, when they had flooded live well boats for lingcod before ice and refrigeration were readily available. They would catch these big lingcods, stick them, unhook them in a live well, and just wait until the day they want to sell them and slaughter them on the day of sale. And of course, the yellow eyes, the red snappers, were coming up helpless with their swim bladder, and so they would just unhook them and let them float away. And the fishing grounds were called the strawberry patch because you'd see all these floating bodies going away. I have an interesting tale. A guy who's a really good commercial fishing guide in Howe Sound. Previous slide that showed a young adult yellow eye with the horizontal white stripes, which they can flash just if they don't want to get beat up. They can do that in an instant, so that a bigger one won't get aggressive. And this guy called to us and he said, "Oh, can you divers help us? We caught this rockfish and it's helpless. We can't get it down under." And I pointed to the bubbles and said, "Well, no, they're down." And so he went off to the side and you could see an eagle going. Anyway, he said, "It's an orange striped rockfish." This is a good one for reef people. An orange striped rockfish? Yeah, I think you call him a canary. "Oh, that's interesting. Oh, yes, we do get canaries time to time in Howe Sound." So after the dive, we could still see seagull off in the distance, and it was actually, they were chasing an eagle, so we could tell if it was a juvenile red snapper, a yellow eye. And this guy who's been guiding all year round for all these years, for over a decade, didn't know it. So I talked to him later, and the fact is, the yellow eye are coming back enough that trolling off bottom over a reef, he ran into one, and that's good news because yellow eye, you know, Bernie Hamby's a good friend of Andy's who just insists that we'll never live to see yellow eyes come back. They are coming back. It's taking a long time.
Yeah, but we're old.
Yeah, we're old. Anyhow, one thing about divers and people who catch fish, probably the most, because I've done this. I once, in Indian Arm, thought I was looking at a China rockfish. I was called an idiot right away, corrected. The sort of dyslexia that occurs is just remember, China rockfish are pale freckles on a dark background. Quillback rockfish are dark freckles on a pale background. Don't get it backwards. Because with ambient light, it can be very difficult to tell blue from brown, that sort of thing. And this is the sort of classic. Probably this one. Oh, yeah, it's better already. Thank you, that's great. So can you now see that the second dorsal fin, the anal fin, and the caudal fin on this quillback are all deep chocolate brown? Very dark. So the whole back end of the body is dark, and so are the pectoral fins. Whereas on the copper rockfish, you have all these pale colors, and the back end of the lateral line is a pale stripe. That's really important. There's one of the common names for copper rockfish in the United States is white belly. And I think, well, that's great, yeah, because technically speaking, this is the only local rockfish that has a white belly most of the time. Not all. So we'll get to that sort of thing. But these are sort of classic textbook images. And does anyone have questions about? I'm going to be nerdy about rockfish identification right now. Okay, so I'm not off the subject, but these all look different. These are the black rockfish that I was talking about earlier. Black China, and we used to always, China rockfish never occur in the Strait of Georgia. Well, around 2008 or so, there were 3 China rockfish, very, very well identified at 3 different locations in Howe Sound. I don't think any of them persisted for more than a few years, right? It's kind of like vermilion rockfish, which will show up in Howe Sound. They'll get bigger. Milton Love has guaranteed you. They always go deep. You're not going to keep seeing them. So either they go into slightly deeper water, or they get caught by a poacher, get eaten by a lingcod. Andy?
If I can interject, those 3 showed up and people actually had photos of them, so there's no doubt what they were.
Right.
But I also talked to people down around Whidbey Island that saw some. And there was some thought that these specimens at Whidbey were escapees from live rockfish, harvesting that were in net pens and somehow had gotten out.
Okay.
And I kind of buy it from there. Now, I don't know if I buy it from
Well,
Sound because I don't know whether
there's no such thing. But the other thing is, if you've seen China rockfish in the Asian life market, are they live animals? This is a philosophical point. And if you believe in euthanasia and you believe in animal suffering and all, these are really, really sad cases when by the time they're in the net pens, they're in really rough shape. Deflating the swim bladder is not always a good thing in the long, long term. The China rockfish that we're seeing in the house now were young, newly maturing adults, and they were gorgeous. All 3 of them, really, really pretty fish, behaving just so perfectly, textbook happy camper behavior, which isn't what you get. So anyway, that's a good question. And of course, so now for a truly bad photograph, I had to put a bad photograph in because this is what you're seeing when you're diving. This is on a sponge reef. So speaking of white belly rockfish, but this is a quillback, okay? Very old quillback often go pale. They get pastier and pastier, and the freckles are clearly there. And you can't see it. There's a copper rockfish right there, and the stripe is quite plain. This picture is actually full of quillbacks. But I just wanted to show a picture of what you often see, which is a fish that's not showing the textbook colors. And quillbacks very often are not black looking from here back. These are very pale looking fins to me. But that's just a big old quillback. And they're really weird morphs that have been documented for color sports, as it were.
And hybrids that have been documented.
Yeah, hybrids. Puget Sound, and for some weird reason, sex gets perverted in Puget Sound. That is my favorite stuff. This is a copper rockfish larva, and Lynn Yamanaka was supposed to have been here, and she was at the Groundfish Conference, in Santa Cruz in 2008 when an old boy named Alan Longhurst, who had been the head of the Dartmouth DFO lab, he'd been the head of the La Jolla National Fisheries Service lab, he'd been a big deal at FAO. He was a grand old man at the end of his life. He was very elderly, and he gave his talk. His talk was titled "The Myth of Sustainability." And his argument was bluefin tuna, yellow eye rockfish, you have all these great big fish that produce phenomenal numbers of tiny, tiny offspring. And it's not like blades of grass and a deer and a cougar, where things are relatively similar sized and it all makes sense in terms of a trophic pyramid. And his argument simply was that in order to have a strong year class, you have to have so much reproduction that you can create your own pyramid of numbers and size differences based on cannibalism. And for me, I worked for 40 years plus raising marine fish. The best food, it's axiomatic, the very, very best food for any type of larval marine fish is larval marine fish. They do really well. And so this is, you can't see that well, but this is a copper rockfish larva. It's a fairly late larva. It's got fin rays, so you can't see the fin rays and such. But I knew when I heard Alan Longhurst's paper that as a graduate student, I had read a paper about Atlantic mackerel. It was a paper from the 30s where year class strength was correlated to Atlantic mackerel, having Atlantic mackerel in their stomachs. And I've never found this paper. This is telling me something about literature. And, I really knocked myself out trying to find this thing. I know the name of the author and everything. Never found it. So I've been treated as a bit of a nutcase where, oh, Jeff and his pyramid scheme. I really wanted to feed rockfish larvae to rockfish larvae and find out at what point in development does a rockfish become competent to predate on newborn rockfish. In Asian rockfish aquaculture, they say it's a bad thing getting them into cannibalism because a big rockfish trying to choke down a larva with head spines can choke to death, and that does happen where they have mortalities associated with it. The mortality rate in the field is such that, you will encounter newborn rockfish and plankton toads easily. You try and find one with all its fin rays. the way mortality goes, they're such rare animals that you're not going to catch them. So anyway, I've done it. We've had the pyramid scheme proven. We had China rockfish that were feeding on copper rockfish, and they were all home free. Every single one of them is alive today. They weren't larvae. Technically speaking, I would say they were pelagic juveniles. They were only 1 centimeter long, but they were perfect little rockfish with fully formed fin rays. Everything was fully formed, and they just, it was like a light switch type of thing. They knew what a larval rockfish was, and they nailed them, and they were doubling their size every 4 or 5 days. It was really remarkable to watch. You had a question?
I just wonder what length that fish would be and how big are they when they are no longer quote-unquote a larva?
Okay, well, so this you can see, you're getting nerdy. It's really important with certain types of teleost fishes that the notochord, like spinal cord, flexes, and the caudal fin rays are horizontal, pointing backwards. So that's post-flexion is an important stage in larval development. They've got the anal and second dorsal rays, but the dorsal fin spines are just what you would call onlogging. There's a basis for them visible, but it isn't fully formed, and it's got all its head spines and such. So I'm guessing that this thing is on the order of 1 centimeter, maybe 11 or 12 millimeters, in which case the juvenile chinas were bigger than this, but you don't have the high spines, dorsal fin there, so that's still a larva. Now, that's a good question because it's a semantic thing, John. I would actually say from the 60s literature, the chinas that were eating newborn coppers would be called, quotes, post-larvae. I call them pelagic juveniles because they're fully formed juveniles morphologically. They don't have their color, and they are not miniatures of an adult. So in terms of a metamorphosis,
But I thought you knew when they start free feeding or
no. It has to do with the
actual development.
their anatomy. They have to be, and for ichthyoplankton people, that all has to do with osteology. It's all clearing and staining. But now, this is getting to the really nerdy stuff, and I wish that Jana Nicholsworth is here because she's a collector of unidentifiable photographs of baby rockfish, you know. And there's a mythological book that has been in review for so long. I'm not sure I believe it's going to come out, but Tom Levick and a bunch of the California people, they'll have a poster session. Goes, who's daddy? You know, who's my daddy? And they'll make a contest out of it. Everybody guesses at what species it is. So in California, quillback rockfish are very rare. It's because of latitudinal depth depression. They're very deep water and they're not common. And Milton Love doesn't even like for people to speak in literature about quillbacks existing in the Southern California bight because they're just not a player in ecology. But of course, quillbacks are important here. So, Jeff's cheats. How do you tell them apart? These are two coppers. And for under-yearlings, the basic rule of thumb is if the vertical stripes that characterize the young are mostly on the body meat, I call it a copper, and the first dorsal fin is fairly low profile. If the first dorsal has a very high profile, and you really are seeing the stripes more on the fin than on the body, and it's blending with freckles, well, of course it's a quillback. There's another way to do it. Look at your depth gauge. If you're at 65 to 80 feet, yeah, it's a quillback. If you're in 25 to 35 feet of water, it's a copper. Look very carefully at 50 feet because it could be either. But the youngest stages, and I can actually, because I've raised the larvae, I can tell them apart when they're very tiny. And a lot of people say, no, you cannot. But I say I can. And it's sort of a demographic thing. On the whole, there's a look. And you can see them schooling around a kelp called a garum. And if they're at the shallowest depth limit of the garum, they're going to be coppers. And if they're at the greatest depth, they're going to be quillbacks. But you can tell them apart. And if people, like the reef divers and all, if we get people who follow this as citizen scientists, that's sort of the reward as you go along, is to finally see a strong year class. And a strong year class of quillbacks is a fairly rare thing. It's a little more frequent with coppers, and it's really fun to try and tell them apart. Now, this is an out of focus black-eyed goby. You know, the little guys. Their jobs don't get any bigger than this. And that's a Puget Sound rockfish. And so again, the slides are sort of poor, but the body profile of a Puget Sound is fairly slender. It's a low profile fin. If you're swimming over a crushed shell hash or sand bottom next to a vertical rock face, and you see a tight school of perfectly translucent but perfectly formed little rockfishes, and they have a low body profile, they are Puget Sounds, because they school like stink when they're first settling, and they're only, you know, this is at body lengths of a couple centimeters or so. And Puget Sounds are a dwarf species, so someone said that 75% of the rockfish in Puget Sound are Puget Sound rockfish. So that's the obvious, because they can't, their mouths can't accept any standard fishing gear. And so we got to this sick state of existence where on the piers in Seattle, you either had guys with stainless leader and heavy gear to catch 6 gills, or mini micro lures to catch Puget Sound rockfish. There's nothing else to fish for. But anyway. So now we're getting into invasive biology. I've only done this once in my life, but that's copper rockfish, that pale stripe on the line. And there's a 7-centimeter yellow spaghetti tag. And I've nailed it with a Hawaiian sling. We did this, and the very first one I ever tagged, it was November of 2006. And I saw a yellow tagged rockfish in April of 2007. So it had to be the same one. And it was the only one that was going away from me as fast as it could swim. This is important to my story. So this is on Boyer Island, just north of Horseshoe Bay. And I've slightly mislabeled because actually this little castle rock is our divider line on this site. So the yellow tags were actually over here. But hey, it didn't fit on this slide. I like the way the slide shows the boulders. So it's a cliff that exfoliates with frost heaving in the winter. and a multi-layered pile of boulders that is going onto a fairly flat sand bottom. It's really only about 25 feet deep. And this is going to be our 10th year. And so Laura Horton said, Jeff, someday we can publish it. So we decided, okay, we're going to publish it now. But this is the site where we came to the realization that you shouldn't do rockfish abundance surveys any time of the year, because this is a site where they go underground for the winter. You won't see any copper rockfish at this site right now, even though there are 200 of them there. And we gradually built up a number of red tags in this site and a bunch of yellow tags on this side, and we never did any tagging around this monument rock. And make a long story short, we only saw red tags where we had tagged them. We only saw yellow tags where we had tagged them. Not all that many, it's the way tagging goes. And I was giving up. I was getting so depressed because it got harder and harder to approach these fish. And so one day I was thinking, we always anchor right off this rock, and I was thinking, oh, maybe I could try green spaghetti tags here, because they're not at all afraid of me. And I went, of course not. They aren't afraid of you because they've never been over here, and they've never been over here, and they've never had a Hawaiian sling zing past them or rip their dorsal fin or anything. I miss as often as I hit. So we kind of gave up on that effort, decided, they really don't go anywhere. And this is, so someone was asking about distances. This is on the order of a 20-meter strip where we were harassing them. Okay, time's almost up. And this is what they look like when they're in hiding. And this is a hypothetical cross-section of boulders to show you it's multi-layered. And the red bow ties represent rockfish that we actually see. And to call it out, we say that it would have to have been picked up by a videotape swimming parallel to the shoreline. But if you have to peek into the rocks to see it, then we call that in. So here in early hiding, there are 3 rockfish that we have to call in. The black bow ties represent rockfish that are so deep that we never see them, and we're taking it on faith that they really are there. And I've got friends who are tagger types who will not believe me. They go, okay, I'm giving up on that because I've got to just take it on belief. So this is an old slide. I don't want to pre-publish data, and they don't even rank La Nina, El Nina. They've changed the anomalies and such, but I will tell you, don't quote me on it, but the title I want to put in is something like, Rockfish choose the anomaly for defining owning events. Because the armchair discussion is, should you have a 0.5 degree centigrade anomaly to define an El Nino or a La Nina? Or should it be only the strong ones, like 1.0 degree centigrade? These copper rockfish at this site basically pay attention to an El Nino that's got an average anomaly of 0.7 or greater, but they won't pay any attention to a La Nina unless it's an anomaly of 1.2 or greater. So, surprise, surprise, they don't even agree on which is which. And I trust them more than I trust any of the modelers. But basically, the brackets show when they go into hiding and when they come out of hiding. And these little carrots here are major Arctic outflow windstorms. So the windstorms actually drive them into hiding, and then they stay in hiding. And in a normal year, or in a weak La Nina, it's exactly half a year they're underground, but they're out more than a month earlier if it's an El Nino, and they stay in more than a month longer if it's a La Nina. And so we're really interested in what's happening right now, because this is a big El Nino that's happening. So I just want to talk briefly about cloud sponges juvenile habitat, which is really important for yelloweye and quillback in particular. How much time exactly?
3 minutes.
Okay. So around these heads of sponge, which could be dead or live, we only see young quillbacks. By the time they're getting bigger, like this one here, they're associating more with the rocks than with the sponges. So it's an important living habitat. And I'm not even saying anything about this because my time is up, but we have citizen scientists who are putting temperature loggers down on their favorite dive sites, and this is a sponge reef, so of course the temperature peaks are lower because it's much deeper. And time's up, so I'm not saying anything more about that. Any questions?
Sorry, for a synopsis, can you just quickly run through?
And the blacks, which are relatively short lifespan, maybe up to half a century. The quillbacks, the yellow eyes, which are long, more than a century. There's one species that's been clocked at over 200 years up in Alaska. Puget Sound's probably not even, maybe 30 years or something, you know?
No, I think they're like 15.
15 or 20?
Yeah.
Oh, we've got longevity records on the hoof at the Vancouver Aquarium. So
Animals that you've had in captivity.
yeah. So yeah.
What was their reproductive times, and how long was it take before they?
Oh well, then for something like a black, like 6-7 years or something, maybe what, a dozen years for quillback or ALI. And of course, then the age at first reproduction is you have maybe 50% maturity of a population. So they're big curves in the Milton Love book that he has on here. Any other questions? Go ahead.